Well, it's been a terrible week in Sydney, and the trauma will be on display for many people, both directly and indirectly attached to the twin stabbing attacks, the two different stabbing attacks in Sydney. So I want to bring in now Psychiatrist Professor Patrick McGorry. Patrick, thanks so much for your time. I'm prompted to talk to you first, and that is with trauma. Trauma associated particularly from those family and friends that know the victims of that stabbing attack. What is your advice and message for them today?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, well, that's absolutely the right first question, because the trauma of such an event is incredibly impactful, and it has a long tail on it too. It's not just trying to get through the next few days of acute grief and shock. There are, as you probably know, there are phases of trauma and grief that people go through, and they're not totally predictable, but they form a pattern, and people go through it at their own pace. And the main thing is to have a lot of support, a lot of practical support around people. And it's not the time to go in and do all the debriefing and the psychological therapies at this point. It's just a question of just stabilizing people's lives and just basically expressing their feelings and taking time out. And sometimes people just feel it's helpful to keep going with certain structured activities as well, so they don't have to think about it all the time. But it's a natural healing process which can be supported. And in a number of cases, it causes longer term problems, and probably in about the 3-month mark, people need to reassess the situation and see how they're going, and they may need at that point, I would say, to sort of start seeing counsellors or therapists. Yeah. But in many disasters or traumas like this, you get too early, you get busloads of therapists arriving, and then it's too soon. You have to deal with the kind of shock and the aftermath, and it's really people close to those left behind that need to be involved, not professionals. Professionals come in later when people haven't recovered.
I've seen what I would describe as an avalanche of protection and love from strangers and friends towards the direct family members of victims. What is your advice to them? How, if you are a friend, how can you best support those other family members?
Well, I think it's just a question of being there, isn't it? And just having EQ, if I can say that, intuition. And if they're your friends, you'll know how to respond. It's like you have a relationship, and you don't need to be a mental health expert to know what to do. It's sort of a natural sort of thing, and there may be practical things you can help with. So you take the load off people because they can't quite function, in the shock, and just doing practical things, and not even necessarily talking about the incidents or going into all of that. Just being there and doing things and being around and being sensitive to people, being guided by the person, following the person in a way. And I also add that the trauma wasn't just to those. Trauma has a kind of a dose effect. If you're right there, or if you're very closely connected in some way, that's high dose. But I think a whole of Sydney, and probably the whole of Australia, was traumatized because of the intense media coverage. The people got exposed to it in a much broader way. So it has a mass effect as well, which it has a really bad effect on the whole country. So I think it's a very complex thing, which we know a lot about. I mean, because these things happen all the time in different ways, whether they're bushfires or incidents like this. Trauma is very common in human life, and mental health. The mental health field knows exactly what to do. It's not always done, because sometimes they still send in all the debriefers and the counsellors straight away, that's not what the evidence shows. That can make things worse. So you have to handle it according to the way the WHO guidelines say a disaster or an event like this should be handled, and governments need to follow those guidelines.
I think when we heard from the parents of Cauchi earlier this week, it was heartbreak all round. You could see that they were devastated that their son had committed such an atrocity. And I'm prompted to talk to you today because I was contacted by a lady named Kay, and she took the time to lay out her personal experience. Her only daughter had serious mental health issues from a very young age, and she wanted me to understand what it was like to have a child in that situation, and I relayed these details to you as well. I wonder if we could speak directly to Kay this morning and other people in her situation.
Okay, absolutely, Laura. Well, as you know, schizophrenia and the treatment of schizophrenia has been a big part of my career. I've been president of the International Schizophrenia Research Society. I've looked after countless people with psychosis and schizophrenia, and we've actually improved the outcomes for those illnesses by intervening early and helping them to make a much better recovery with holistic care. And that, to some extent, did happen with Joel Cauchi. He did pretty well after being treated initially for many years, actually, when he was receiving effective treatment. And these illnesses can be effectively treated in most cases. But the problem was, because our mental health system is so threadbare across the country, and you and I have talked about this many times, what's happened to Joel is almost the norm for seriously mentally ill people, or certainly way too many of them. They are, if they improve and they get a bit better, they're discharged from the vital services that they need, which are in incredibly short supply through state governments since the closure of the mental hospitals. They haven't done their job in providing a safe and environment for the states that they operate in. The community mental health system is very modest and is overwhelmed with demand. So there are hundreds of Joel Cauchis wandering around Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne as we speak, off medication, disengaged from their families and disengaged from the effective care that would keep them well and would keep the community safe. Now, it's a rare event because most people with schizophrenia are not violent and never will be. And the ones that do things like Joel did, he was a very good person when he was well. You could hear all the evidence about him when he was treated and well was there was nothing wrong with his character or his personality. It's the illness that has caused these events. The fact that the illness was allowed to flare up, remain untreated, and completely take over his mind. So he did things that were unspeakable. And that is a risk with a very small number of people with schizophrenia. Most people with schizophrenia, well, are safer than the general population. They're more likely to be victims of crime than actually to commit any criminal offences. So the ones that are allowed to deteriorate to this stage really stigmatise everyone with schizophrenia. So everyone with schizophrenia in Australia today would be feeling very hurt as well because their identity and image as a person has been harmed by these acts, which were preventable if we had functioning mental health systems in New South Wales and all of the states. The federal government's got a massive role to play here too, because there's a very big gap which exists between the boundaries of the state services and what GPs and the primary care sector provides. We call this the missing middle, as you know. So Joel fell into the missing middle, even though he was in the very severe end of need for care.
Pat, we'll have to leave it there for today. I know it's a longer conversation, but thanks for making some kind of sense of it for us today, and also that advice and how we can support our family and friends. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for your great support of mental health as always.